Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn their diverse stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. On today's episode, Dr. Emile Gouws joins us to discuss being a non-speaking child and turning lived experience into advocacy. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Dr. Gouws, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's a major honor. Thank you.
I'd love to start off by learning, where does your story begin in the autistic community?
Well, Doug, I'm an autism advocate from South Africa. I was diagnosed at the age of 3.5 years. I was non-speaking until the age of 15 years. And it was actually a pre-primary school educator that noticed that I portrayed ASD tendencies. The tendencies which I refer to is non-speaking, general frustration, anxiety, stimming, and also basically a gross and finer motor skills that wasn't developed yet. And it became to a point where they actually, where the pre-primary school principal told my parents that they need to institutionalize me based on my differences. And keep in mind that the early 1990s, autism wasn't actually formally popular, especially from the global south. And a multidisciplinary team, when you look at occupational speech therapists, as well as a psychologist that assisted. And that occurred from the age of 3.5 years until 9, and was placed into a mainstream school, and there were a lot of masculine ableist expectations that contributed towards my difficulty and my experiences that I experienced. And being in a mainstream education environment, it was extremely difficult. I remember fondly, because of my ability not to communicate, and keep in mind that this was before AAC, these alternative communication devices were actually formally introduced, and I made use of my hands to communicate, to express my frustrations. And in the school, I remember fondly, there was my second grade teacher tied up my hands because of a lack of understanding. And little did I know how much damage it will cause later on in my life, when you look particularly at my mental health challenges that I would have experienced. And the segregation, the isolationism occurred in many forms as well. And eventually, as someone who was non-speaking, it was extremely challenging to cope academically as well. But eventually, I went into the high school environment where I eventually became semi-verbal after the age of 16. And that is where my process started uphill. But, when you look particularly at the diagnosis of autism, I always say to people when they ask for the definition, it comes down to three things. It comes down to time, place, and people. And you will look particularly at the time you refer to when I was officially diagnosed. And also when you look particularly at autism awareness, how much autism awareness was generally out there when you look at the early 1990s, etc., and early 2000s. And then when you look at place, you look particularly at the environments which I was in. When you look particularly at the school, university, general society in general. And then thirdly, the people. And when you look particularly at people, you look at specifically teachers that don't understand neurodiversity, or lecturers at university, etc. But I found that those lecturers who actually tried to accommodate me were those who had the personal experience with neurodivergence, or had a sibling, or was it a former teacher in an education environment that taught autistic children, or had some form of knowledge of it to provide me reasonable accommodations in those specific situations. But it was extremely uphill battle to cope. But like I said, when you look at the definition of autism, it's a neurodevelopmental, and with every experience, neuroplasticity can come forth. And I must say that my autism journey was long and hard, and when you look particularly at what Autism South Advocacy did for me, it brought me to my family, my wife, our carer, my mother-in-law, Makim, and it contributed a lot towards me having a purpose, being a postdoctoral fellow, uh, on my way to become a professor. And yeah, the journey continues.
You mentioned being non-speaking as a child, and I read where you mentioned that hands were your first language. What do you think it's important to know about hand movements from autistic people of all ages in regards to communication?
It's actually a very interesting question, a very important one. And like I said previously, my hands is particularly my way of, expressing myself, and still is, at the age of 32, when I'm frustrated, when I'm excited, that strict, rigid hand movements is always present. It was, like I said, that it was my way of communicating as well. And it can be a sensory thing as well, because I tend to, I like to touch certain objects, certain things. And my hands was my way of connecting to my surroundings as well. And I think communication wise, before AAC, etc., in my personal experience, it was my way. And people didn't understand, society didn't understand the strict, rigid movements that I portrayed. Some were regarded as weird. Some were regarded as, a deficit as well. But if you look particularly at the neurodiverse brain, etc., and referring to the part that has to do with sensory impulse, etc., then you understand why touch is very important, why the hand movements. And I always say that people don't understand what they do not see, but what they see is they will be able to accommodate. And I always say that when you look particularly at understanding a neurodiverse individual's frustrations, their specific requirements, their specific needs, you'll be able to accommodate them as well. And my hands is particularly my way of communicating. It's my way of connecting to their specific environment. And although I've learned later on in my life to verbalize my emotions, verbalize my feelings, my hand still plays a part in communicating as well. And it's just it's part of my own autism diagnosis, my own neurodiversity. And it's something that people need to accept.
For those of us who are able to speak, there's a privilege to that in the sense that society seems to prioritize spoken communication as a superior form of communication. What do you think people should think about in regards to this privilege?
Let me tell you, when you look particularly at my personal experiences as being a non speaking autistic individual, I want to remind you that there's always a definition between non speaking versus not being present. And that's a total misconception because when you look particularly at my ability as an autistic individual, I was always, I was always present in a particular environment. And I always had the sentences in my head. I always had the ability to be able to have the sentences in my head. I was like, being non-speaking doesn't mean I have nothing to say. And I always had that perception. It simply means that I use other ways to communicate, such as writing, typing, or now, and I still believe that I'm now in my 7th year of developing speech. Too often, society confuses speech with intelligence, but speech is only one form of communication. I and many others have valuable contributions, even when we do not use our speech. And I wanted to say to you that the biggest challenge for me personally is not my autism diagnosis, but society's lack of understanding. Because many assume that if I will refer to myself, I'm not speaking doesn't mean that I'm not capable. And that's wrong. Communication barriers, stigma, and a lack of accessibility create the real challenges. If I can provide you an example, generally, and this is a general challenge in education, when education systems and workplaces are not always designed for non speakers in mind, they will eventually exclude them for from opportunities. And I've learned to also during the years I've learned to cope with my speech delay because I use different strategies, and this is I would say from the age of 9 until the age of 15, 16, and even now today, I use different strategies such as writing, typing, as even now structured speech and platforms now like social media and academic work. At the United Nations and at international conferences, I always share my messages through prepared statements and research because my strength lies in turning lived experience into advocacy that creates change for millions of neurodivergent people. And being non-speaking, when you look particularly at the non-speaking community, your non-speaking community brings creativity, resilience, and unique perspectives. And this is based on your question. Because we communicate differently, let me put it that way. We often see the world differently. And I will use my experience to connect with others to build advocacy networks and push for inclusion. Because our different ways of communicating are not weaknesses, they are strengths. They can transform society if people are willing to listen, to willing to understand, and also willing to accommodate.
I wanted to ask you about nonprofit board of directors because I think oftentimes as autistic people, we're sort of token members on these boards, if there's any representation of us at all. So you're the president of the board of directors for ICDL. DIR floor time. And that makes me wonder about how your lived experience is valued on this board, and the result, how that impacts board meetings and the scope of the organization.
That's a very important question because yes, being on the board of board of directors and being now my second term of being president, my presence shares a message. And this was the one of the biggest goals of electing me president, one of the biggest strategies as well. And this aligns with the different learning capacities which RCDL floor time talks about, referring to the different stages of development. And this aligns also with the founder of RCDL, Dr. Stanley Greenspan's a vision for floor time and for the development of strategies to accommodate not only your neurodivergent students, individuals, but also individuals in general, connecting in a different way. And my presence ensures representation of autistic voices, especially from the global south. Too often decisions about autism are made without autistic people at the table. And my role challenges that by bringing lived experiences, cultural perspectives, and advocacy into leadership spaces. But like we always say, that representation matters, and it ensures that strategies and programs are not only professional, but they are also authentic and inclusive. When you look particularly at DR floor time, which is a developmental approach that respects individual differences and focuses on relationships, it sees each person as unique rather than trying to, like we said, fix them. This is based on the Mayuko perspective, which influences the neurodiverse community, the autistic community. As an autistic person, this approach values me for who I am instead of forcing me into the narrow definitions of your typical individual, your typical board member, because that is powerful because it promotes dignity, respect, and growth through human connection, not compliance. And my lived experience, and this is what I also intend with my advocacy, gives real insight into how policies and practices affect neurodivergent people. Because I can, from my personal perspective, I can highlight barriers that professionals might overlook, like communication challenges, stigma, or access issues in the global south. And I'm privileged to know that this board values my input because it grounds theory and research in reality. And although the board is mostly global north representation, I'm the only one from global south. I've learned that the neurodivergent community, etc., although we've got different lived experiences, our the fight stays the same, which contribute towards our own understanding, our different traditions, our different religions, but also highlights the gaps that we need to fill. And I'm not just speaking for myself, but I amplifying voices of others who are often left unheard.
You mentioned earlier you're a postdoc fellow, and you're in the Department of Inclusive Education at the University of South Africa. When you think about inclusive education, what are some of the most important things to think about for neurodivergent learners, specifically to be seen and valued in those environments?
Inclusive education means, and this is based on my advocacy as well, because my advocacy, being an international audience of advocate and speaking on higher political levels such as United Nations, attending these meetings and Commonwealth as well, my advocacy is based on the United Nations Convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And by knowing the different articles, especially Article 24, which provides us a perfect theory and philosophy and I would say a roadmap on what inclusive education means and which each country assigned to, that it means that every individual, every student, every learner, regardless of their disability or difference, has equal access to learning opportunities in the same environment as their peers. You know, research shows that when education systems are inclusive, all students will benefit, not only your students, your disabled students, because inclusion promotes empathy, collaboration, and stronger society. It's not just about placing learners in the same classroom, it's about providing the necessary reasonable accommodations, referring to the right support, the right teaching strategies, flexibility, where everyone can thrive. You know, as an autistic individual that lived through the education environment as well, and being in the education environment myself, autistic individuals face many challenges in the education system. And I understand how powerful inclusion can be because you are not inviting that person to sit at the table, you are actually telling them that they belong there. Because too often, and this is referring to the previous questions, we're referring to your non speaking autistic neurodivergent individuals. Too often, your neurodivergent individuals are excluded, underestimated, or placed into separate systems. You know, let me give you a simple example, and this is reality of what we currently experience in the global south. You know, in South Africa, for instance, you know that we've got the highest suicide rate of neurodivergent individuals in the world. The living age of an autistic person in South Africa is 35 years old. Why? Because of depression, anxiety, and these individuals do not necessarily have a purpose. And it's a holistic cycle that keeps repeating itself, and it all draws back to education. You know, and that's the significance of the power of education as well. Because let's face it, we've got the challenge in South Africa where majority of autistic individuals do not have access to formal education. We are struggling, you know, and inclusive education is not always a reality. Many children are still denied access because of stigma, lack of teacher training, limited resources. And this is what I tend to do in my advocacy. My research and advocacy focus on changing this to ensure that all learners, especially on the continent of Africa and across low to middle income countries, are not left behind, because inclusive education is a human right, not a privilege. And that is what we currently do on our social media platform on Facebook called the Special Need Cafe, which our listeners and which everyone can join, where myself and my family share our experiences. You know, Markim and myself and my wife Sammy, we do advocacy on these avenues as well, because we are currently experiencing a lot of challenges in our own country as well, and the fight continues continuously. And inclusive education is about access, dignity, and opportunity. It means seeing the strengths of every individual, including your autistic and your non-speaking students, and building systems where no one is left out, because we all contribute towards the paradigm shift, which all of us are working towards.
And lastly, how can our listeners connect and learn from you beyond this interview?
Well, the most important thing is to to connect through social media and to to connect to me on social media, different social media platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook. It's important for us to, wherever we are, to stand together and to accommodate each other because, you know, although we are in different countries, although we are in different parts of the world, our socioeconomic circumstances are different, our experiences are different, but the autism spectrum and the neurodiversity movement stays the same. And you will be surprised how many correlations are there between our different communities. So definitely, let's work together because together we are stronger.
Well, Dr. Gouws, it was a pleasure to meet you, and thanks so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks so much to Dr. Gouws for the conversation. To learn more about Dr. Gouws, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode regarding what do you think is most important in creating inclusive education? Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to be the best version of their authentic selves through customized life coaching and community groups. We also support parents and partners of autistic people by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. So please visit autismpersonalcoach.com to begin your experience of judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.